welcome back to Nighttime History. Today, we will be following a medieval merchant named Thomas of Winchester as he makes his autumn journey through the English countryside in the year 1347, just before the Great Plague would change everything. We'll walk beside him as he navigates dirt roads and river crossings, as he hauls precious cargo across a landscape dotted with manors and monasteries, as he negotiates with toll collectors and innkeepers, and as he conducts business in the bustling market squares of small towns. Thank you for joining us tonight. Sit back and relax as we dive deep into the real world of medieval commerce, exploring the daily rhythms, constant calculations, and unexpected challenges that shaped the life of those who moved goods across the land in an age before banks, before insurance, before any of the protections we take for granted today. The first light of dawn breaks over Winchester on a cool September morning, and Thomas is already awake in the small room he rents above a cobbler's shop. The air smells of leather and wood smoke, familiar scents that have filled his mornings for the past 3 years, since he established himself as an independent cloth merchant. He is 32 years old, neither young nor old by the standards of his time, with the weathered hands of someone who has spent countless hours examining fabric and the sharp eyes of a man who has learned to spot quality and deception in equal measure. Unlike the romantic image of the wealthy merchant draped in furs and jewels, Thomas dresses practically in a wool tunic, dyed a modest brown, sturdy leather boots that have been resoled twice, and a heavy cloak that will serve him well on the road. His most valuable possessions are not worn on his body, but carried in his mind, the network of contacts, the knowledge of prices in different towns, the understanding of which roads are passable in autumn and which become rivers of mud. Thomas eats a simple breakfast of bread and cheese, harder than he would like but sufficient, washed down with weak ale because the water in Winchester cannot always be trusted. Picture this moment, the quiet before a journey begins, when a merchant sits in semi-darkness reviewing his plans, wondering about the weather, about the roads, about whether the investment he has made will return profit or loss. He owns no shop, no grand establishment with apprentices and servants. He is what we might call a travelling merchant, a chapman or peddler, operating at a level above the poorest hawkers, but below the great wholesale dealers who never leave the cities. His business model is straightforward. Buy cloth in Winchester, where weavers produce quality woolens, transport it to towns and villages where such cloth commands higher prices, sell it at market, then purchase local goods, cheese perhaps, or metalwork, or pottery, and bring those items back to Winchester to sell to merchants who supply larger markets. Each journey is a cycle, each cycle a gamble. By the time the sun has fully risen, Thomas is at the city stables where he keeps his packhorse, a sturdy mare named Bess, who has served him faithfully for 4 years. Imagine standing here in the stable yard, breathing in the strong smell of horses and hay and manure, hearing the sounds of animals shifting in their stalls, and stable boys calling to one another as they begin their morning work. Bess is not a beautiful animal by any measure, but she is reliable, calm in temperament, and strong enough to carry the 120 pounds of cloth that Thomas has wrapped in oiled canvas and loaded into panniers that hang on either side of her back. The popular image of medieval merchants leading long caravans of camels or dozens of packhorses comes from tales of exotic Eastern traders or the great Italian merchant houses. The reality for someone like Thomas is far more modest: 1 man, 1 horse, and goods worth perhaps £3 in total, a significant sum representing nearly all of his working capital, but hardly a fortune. Before leaving Winchester, Thomas must settle his accounts. He visits the weaver from whom he purchased the cloth 2 days earlier, a master craftsman named John Webber, who operates 3 looms in a workshop near the cathedral. The transaction involves no paper money, no checks, nothing we would recognise as modern currency in large denominations. Instead, Thomas counts out silver pennies, the backbone of English commerce, along with a few half pennies and farthings. The coins are worn smooth from countless transactions, some clipped or shaved by dishonest handlers over the years. A constant problem that makes merchants weigh coins as often as they count them. Thomas and John conduct their business with the formality of men who've dealt together before, but maintain a professional distance. There are no written contracts for a transaction of this size. A man's word, his reputation in the guild, his standing in the community, these are the guarantees that matter. Break your word in a town like Winchester, and you will find no one willing to trade with you within a fortnight. The city gates open at sunrise, and Thomas leads Bess through the east gate, nodding to the gatekeeper who knows him by sight. Contrary to the myth that medieval people rarely travelled, the road is already busy with traffic. Farmers drive small carts laden with vegetables toward the city market. A group of pilgrims, perhaps 20 in number, walks together singing a hymn, heading toward Canterbury or perhaps to one of the local shrines. 2 Franciscan friars walk barefoot despite the chill, their grey robes marking them as members of the order dedicated to poverty. A messenger on horseback trots past, carrying letters sealed with wax, probably in the service of some lord or bishop. The medieval road is not empty or lonely. It is a highway of humanity, each person moving with purpose through a landscape that is far more populated and interconnected than we often imagine. The road itself would disappoint anyone expecting the smooth stone highways of Rome. This is a dirt track, wide enough for 2 carts to pass, but rutted from years of use, muddy in low spots despite the recent dry weather. Thomas knows this road well. He has travelled it 6 times this year alone. The route he has chosen will take him northeast toward Alresford, then on to Alton, and finally to Farnham, the journey of roughly 30 miles that he plans to complete over 2 days, with an overnight stop in Alton. 30 miles may seem a modest distance to modern sensibilities, but consider the reality of medieval travel. There are no shock absorbers, no paved surfaces, no reliable maps. The pace is set by the walking speed of a loaded pack horse, perhaps 2.5 miles per hour under good conditions. Hills must be climbed, streams forded, and frequent stops made to rest the animal and adjust the load. As Thomas walks beside Bess, the countryside unfolds around him in a patchwork of cultivated fields and remaining woodland. September is harvest time, and in every direction he can see peasants working in the fields, cutting wheat and barley with sickles, binding sheaves, loading carts. The popular image of medieval agriculture as primitive and inefficient misses the sophistication of the 3-field system that has been practiced in England for centuries. These fields are organised, rotated, managed according to traditions refined over generations. Thomas passes through the lands of several different manors, though the boundaries are not always obvious to the casual observer. Each manor is a small world unto itself, with its lord or lady holding authority over the peasants who work the land, its own mill and church, its own customs and obligations. As a merchant, Thomas exists somewhat outside this feudal structure. He is neither noble nor peasant, but a member of the growing class of townspeople whose loyalty is not to land but to coin, not to lords but to customers. Picture this moment as Thomas crests a small hill and pauses to let Bess rest. The view stretches for miles, a landscape of fields and villages, church towers rising like stone fingers pointing toward heaven. threads of smoke rising from countless hearths. The air is clear and clean in a way that will not exist once industrialization fills the skies with coal smoke. Birds wheel overhead, crows and rooks heading toward the harvested fields where grain has been spilled. The sound of church bells carries on the wind, marking the hour of terce, mid-morning prayer, a sound that structures time across Christian Europe. Thomas offers Bess water from a leather bucket, checking her hooves for stones, adjusting the panniers to ensure the weight remains balanced. A merchant's relationship with his pack horse is not sentimental, but it is grounded in mutual dependence. Bess is a tool, an investment, but also a living creature whose health and comfort directly affect Thomas's livelihood. After 2 hours on the road, Thomas encounters his first toll. A wooden barrier blocks the road where it crosses a bridge over a small river, and a man in a leather jerkin sits on a stool beside a small shelter. This is not a robber or outlaw, but an authorized toll collector, licensed by the local lord to extract payment from all who use the bridge. The toll system is one of the great frustrations of medieval commerce, and one of the aspects most misunderstood by modern observers. We imagine tolls as occasional inconveniences, but in reality, a merchant travelling any significant distance might encounter a dozen or more toll points, each demanding payment. The amounts are small, usually a penny or halfpenny, but they accumulate, eating into profit margins that are already thin. The toll collector examines Thomas's goods with practiced eyes, assessing their value to determine the appropriate fee. There is room for negotiation here, for argument about whether cloth should be charged at the rate for luxury goods or common merchandise. But Thomas has travelled this road before and knows this collector. They exchange a few words about the weather, about the harvest, about a mutual acquaintance in Alresford, and then Thomas pays his halfpenny and continues on his way. This small social interaction, repeated at toll booths across the kingdom, is part of the invisible network that makes commerce possible. The accumulated goodwill of familiar faces and repeated transactions. The road winds through a dense stretch of forest, and here Thomas becomes more alert. The popular image of medieval forests filled with robbers and outlaws is exaggerated, but not entirely false. Most travellers pass unmolested, but a man alone with valuable goods is vulnerable. Thomas carries a short knife at his belt, useful for cutting rope or trimming candles, but of limited value as a weapon. Some merchants travel in groups for protection, but Thomas prefers to travel alone, moving faster and attracting less attention. He listens to the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the call of wood pigeons, the snap of a branch that might be a deer or might be something else. Imagine being here in this moment, surrounded by trees that block the sun, walking a road that is barely more than a path, aware that help is miles away in any direction. The forest is not the enchanted woodland of fairy tales, but a working landscape, a place where peasants gather firewood and acorns for their pigs, where nobles hunt deer and boar, where the boundary between civilization and wilderness feels permeable. Thomas emerges from the forest without incident and reaches the town of Alresford by early afternoon. The town is small, perhaps 500 inhabitants, but it has a market charter granted by the king, which means that every Thursday merchants can gather to trade without harassment from the Lord's officials. Today is Wednesday, so there is no formal market, but Thomas knows that trade happens every day if you know where to look. He leads Bess through narrow streets lined with timber-framed houses, their upper stories overhanging the streets so dramatically that neighbours in facing buildings could almost touch hands across the gap. The smell of the town is immediate and overwhelming to modern sensibilities, a mixture of animal waste, tanning leather, brewing ale, wood smoke, and humanity packed closely together. Medieval people did not have our sensitivity to odours, or perhaps more accurately, they had no choice but to accept them. Thomas has no intention of staying in Alresford, but he stops at a bakery to purchase bread and at a well to draw water for himself and Bess. The baker, a woman named Agnes, whom Thomas has bought from before, tells him that the road ahead toward Alton has been in poor condition after recent rains. This is valuable intelligence, the kind of local knowledge that can save a merchant hours of difficulty or even prevent disaster. Thomas thanks her, purchases an extra loaf for the journey, and continues on his way. These brief interactions, these exchanges of news and gossip, are the medieval equivalent of traffic reports and weather forecasts passed from person to person in an oral network that spans the kingdom. The afternoon journey toward Alton is more difficult than the morning. The road climbs into higher country, and true to Agnes's warning, there are stretches where mud has pooled in low spots, forcing Thomas to lead Bess carefully around the edges or through shallower paths worn by other travellers. At one point, a cart has become stuck in a particularly deep, muddy section, and the carter and his son are struggling to free it. Thomas stops to help, not out of pure altruism, but because this is the custom of the road. Travellers help one another, knowing that next time the situation might be reversed. Together, the three men push and pull, speaking little, saving their breath for the work. The cart finally lurches free with a sucking sound, and the carter offers Thomas a drink from his flask, which turns out to contain rough cider. They stand together for a moment, breathing hard, and the carter mentions that he heard rumours of sickness in Southampton, people dying with swellings and fever. Thomas files this information away, troubling but distant. He does not know, cannot know, that within a year the plague will have reached England, that the world he knows is about to be transformed in ways he cannot imagine. Thomas reaches Alton as the sun begins to lower toward the horizon. This is a larger town than Alresford, perhaps 1,000 souls, with a church, an abbey, and several inns that cater to travellers. The choice of where to stay is important. The cheapest option would be to sleep in a barn or stable, paying a few pennies for the privilege of spreading his cloak on hay. But Thomas has goods to protect and prefers the relative security of an inn. He chooses the Swan, an establishment he has used twice before, run by a man named Robert who maintains a reputation for honesty, which in the innkeeping business is worth more than comfortable beds. The inn is a 2-story timber building with a stable attached, and the main room is already filling with travellers, locals, and a group of merchants who appear to be dealers in wool, judging by the smell that clings to their clothes. Picture this scene, the warmth of a fire in the central hearth, the low murmur of conversations in English and French, the clatter of wooden bowls and cups, the barking of dogs hoping for scraps. The lighting comes from the fire, from rushlights soaked in fat, and from a few precious candles, creating a space of shadows and flickering illumination. Thomas negotiates his lodging with Robert, agreeing to pay 3 pennies for a bed in the common sleeping room upstairs, fodder for Bess, and inclusion in the evening meal. The price is fair, but not cheap. Thomas estimates that lodging and tolls will consume roughly 10% of his potential profit on this journey, a significant overhead that must be carefully calculated when deciding whether a trading venture is worthwhile. We've been travelling alongside Thomas for many hours now, watching as he navigates the practical challenges of medieval commerce. And if you're enjoying this journey through history, If this window into the past has captured your imagination, we'd be grateful if you would subscribe to Nighttime History and turn on notifications to support our channel. It helps us continue creating these detailed historical journeys. Make sure to like this video to help others discover these stories, and let us know in the comments where you're settling in to sleep tonight, what time it is where you are, whether you're drifting off to the sounds of medieval trade, or staying awake to hear how Thomas's journey unfolds. The evening meal at the Swan is simple but substantial. A thick pottage of peas and barley with chunks of salted pork, served with bread and washed down with ale. Thomas eats from a wooden bowl, using his own knife and a spoon provided by the inn, sitting at a long table with other travellers. The conversation flows around him. A merchant complaining about the price of salt. A pilgrim describing a miraculous healing he witnessed at a shrine. A local farmer worried about the weather turning before all the harvest is in. Thomas listens more than he speaks, gathering information, assessing the mood and concerns of the people around him. This is part of his work too, understanding the currents of supply and demand, knowing where scarcity drives up prices and where abundance creates opportunity. As the evening deepens, a travelling entertainer, a jongleur, enters the inn and offers to perform for food and drink. Robert agrees, and the man produces a small harp and begins to sing, a tale of Roland and Oliver and the battles in Spain, performed in French but with enough English interspersed that most of the audience can follow. The popular image of medieval entertainment focuses on grand tournaments and courtly love. But this is the reality for most people. A travelling performer in a provincial inn, singing songs that mix history and legend into something that both educates and entertains. Thomas enjoys the performance, but does not let it distract him from his vigilance. His goods are locked in the stable, but locks can be picked and stable boys can be bribed. He makes a point of visiting Bess one more time before retiring, checking that everything is secure, speaking quietly to the stable boy and slipping him an extra farthing to keep watch. The sleeping room upstairs is a communal space with a dozen straw mattresses laid out on the floor, separated by thin partitions that provide the illusion of privacy, but no real barrier against sound or smell. Thomas claims a spot near the wall, spreading his cloak over the mattress and using his leather satchel as a pillow. The room gradually fills with other sleepers, their snoring and shifting, creating a constant background noise. Sleep comes fitfully, as it always does in strange places. But Thomas is accustomed to this. He has slept in far worse conditions, in barns and under hedges, once in a church porch when caught by darkness between towns. The life of a travelling merchant is not one of comfort, but Thomas has never expected comfort. He expects only the opportunity to work, to trade, to slowly accumulate the capital that might someday allow him to establish a permanent shop, to marry perhaps, to rise from the precarious existence of a chapman to the relative stability of a settled merchant. Morning comes early at the Swan, announced by a rooster and by Robert moving through the inn, rousing guests who have paid for breakfast. Thomas rises, splashes cold water on his face from a basin in the yard, and joins the others for a meal of bread and cheese, similar to what he ate yesterday in Winchester, but somehow less appealing after a night of poor sleep. He settles his account with Robert, checking the calculation carefully because innkeepers have been known to add phantom charges for services not rendered. The account is fair, and Thomas pays, adding his transaction to the mental ledger he maintains of trustworthy establishments and reliable contacts. The second day of travel begins with Thomas leading Bess north out of Alton toward Farnham, a distance of about 10 miles. The morning is cooler than yesterday, with a mist hanging over the fields that will burn off as the sun rises. The road is busier today, perhaps because it is Thursday and market day in Farnham, drawing traders and farmers from the surrounding area. Thomas falls into step with a man driving a small flock of sheep, and they walk together for a mile or so, exchanging the kind of casual conversation that makes the journey pass more quickly. The shepherd is taking his animals to sell at Farnham Market, hoping to get a good price before winter, when feed becomes scarce. He asks Thomas about cloth prices, wondering if the wool from his sheep might be worth more if he saved it to sell to a weaver rather than selling the animals whole. Thomas, always happy to discuss his trade, explains the complexities of wool pricing, how the quality varies by breed and season, how weavers prefer certain types for certain fabrics, how the export market to Flanders affects prices throughout England. This is the kind of knowledge that defines Thomas's expertise, not learned from books, but accumulated through years of practical experience. They part ways at a crossroads, and Thomas continues alone, climbing into higher ground where the views stretch for miles across Hampshire. Imagine standing here on this rise, looking out over a landscape that would be recognisable to travellers a century before and a century hence. The same patchwork of fields and forest, the same stone churches, the same rhythm of agricultural life that has persisted since the Norman conquest and will persist for centuries more. The permanence of the medieval landscape is striking to modern eyes, accustomed to constant change. These villages have stood for generations. These roads have been walked by countless feet. Change comes slowly here, measured in lifetimes rather than years. Thomas encounters his second major toll of the journey, where the road crosses into the lands controlled by the Bishop of Winchester. The toll here is higher, a full penny, and the collector is officious, demanding to inspect the cloth and questioning whether Thomas has paid the required taxes in Winchester. Thomas produces a small wooden tally stick, notched and marked, to show that he has indeed paid the appropriate town taxes, and the collector grudgingly allows him to pass. This interaction highlights one of the constant tensions of medieval commerce, the desire of local authorities to extract revenue from trade versus the need to keep tolls low enough that merchants continue to use the roads. Too many tolls or too high charges, and traders find alternative routes or simply avoid the region altogether. The balance is delicate, and lords who are too greedy often find their toll revenues declining as merchants take their business elsewhere. As Thomas approaches Farnham, the traffic on the road increases significantly. He passes carts laden with firewood, women carrying baskets of eggs and butter, a blacksmith's apprentice leading a donkey loaded with iron tools, a group of monks from a nearby priory walking in silent procession. The diversity of people and goods illustrates the complexity of the medieval economy, which is not the primitive barter system often imagined, but a sophisticated network of specialized production and exchange. The blacksmith does not make his own food. The farmer does not weave his own cloth. The weaver does not forge his own tools. Each depends on others, and the market is where these dependencies are negotiated and fulfilled. Farnham is a substantial market town, larger than Alton, with a castle overlooking the settlement from a hill and a long main street lined with shops and houses. The market is held in the open square near the church, and by the time Thomas arrives in late morning, it is in full swing. Picture this scene: dozens of stalls and temporary booths, merchants calling out their wares, customers haggling over prices, animals being traded, money changing hands. The noise is tremendous. A cacophony of human voices, animal sounds, the clang of a smith working at a portable forge, the creak of cart wheels. The smell is equally intense. Roasting meat from a food vendor, fresh bread, leather, wool. The general funk of unwashed humanity, pressed close together. This is commerce in its most elemental form. Buyers and sellers meeting face to face. Value determined not by abstract market forces, but by direct negotiation between individuals. Thomas secures a spot for his display, paying the market official 2 pennies for the right to trade. He unloads his cloth from Bess's panniers and spreads it out on a piece of canvas, arranging it to show the quality of the weave and the richness of the dye. The cloth he carries is not the finest available, not the scarlet or gold that only nobles can afford, but good quality woolens in practical colours, browns and greens and greys, suitable for prosperous farmers, craftsmen and minor clergy. His pricing strategy is carefully calculated. He knows what he paid in Winchester, he knows his costs for transport and tolls, and he knows roughly what the market will bear in Farnham. His target is a profit of about 30%, which sounds generous but must cover not only this journey, but also the times when he fails to sell, when goods are damaged in transport, when he misjudges the market and must sell at a loss. The first customers are browsers, people touching the cloth, asking questions, but not ready to buy. Thomas is patient with them, knowing that browsers often become buyers and that every interaction is an opportunity to build reputation. A woman examines a length of green wool, testing the weight and texture, asking about colour fastness and whether the dye will run in rain. Thomas assures her that the dye is set properly, made by a Winchester dyer who uses good mordants and knows his craft. He offers to cut her a piece and hold it at an agreed price while she finishes her other market business, a small gesture of trust that obligates her to return. This is the art of selling, understanding human nature, building confidence, creating obligation without pressure. By midday, Thomas has sold 3 pieces of cloth, about a third of his inventory, and the transactions have all been in silver pennies, carefully counted and bitten to test for base metal, then deposited in the leather purse he keeps inside his tunic, close to his body. The prices achieved are close to what he hoped, and he allows himself a moment of satisfaction. A successful market day is never guaranteed, and there have been times when he has stood all day with barely a sale, forced to pack up his goods and move on, the investment of time and travel yielding nothing. Those failures are part of the business, calculated risks that sometimes fail to pay off, but today is not one of those days. Between sales, Thomas explores the market himself, looking for goods to purchase for the return journey to Winchester. He examines pottery from a local kiln, well made but not distinctive enough to command premium prices in the city. He considers honey and beeswax from a beekeeper, valuable commodities that transport well, but the prices are higher than he hoped. He inspects leather goods, bags and belts and shoes, made by craftsmen who have set up temporary workshops in the market square. The leather is good quality, tanned properly without the shortcuts that result in goods that crack and fail after a few months. He negotiates with a leather worker named Simon, eventually agreeing to purchase a dozen belts at a bulk price. The belts are not luxuries, but necessities, the kind of practical goods that sell steadily in Winchester to craftsmen and labourers. The transaction is concluded with a handshake, and Thomas arranges to collect the belts in the late afternoon after he has finished selling his cloth. As the afternoon progresses, Thomas notices a commotion at the edge of the market square. A group of officials, recognizable by their staffs of office, are moving through the market inspecting weights and measures. This is the market court in action, enforcing the regulations that are supposed to ensure fair trade. The popular myth that medieval markets were lawless free-for-alls is far from the truth. Markets were heavily regulated, with strict rules about weights and measures, about the quality of goods, about where and when trading could occur. Punishments for cheating could be severe. Public humiliation in the stocks, fines that could bankrupt a small trader, even banishment from the market. Thomas ensures that his own dealings are scrupulous, measuring cloth carefully, giving full weight for the price charged. He has seen dishonest merchants prosper in the short term, but the long-term cost to reputation makes such tactics foolish for anyone who plans to trade in the same markets repeatedly. The market begins to wind down as the afternoon lengthens toward evening. Those who came from outlying villages are packing up to ensure they reach home before dark. Unsold goods are repacked into carts and panniers. The food vendors who set up at dawn to catch the early crowd are packing away their remaining pies and bread. Thomas has sold all but one piece of his cloth, a better result than he had hoped for. The final piece he sells at a discount to a tailor who promises to spread word of Thomas's quality among his customers, an investment in future business that is worth the reduced profit. Thomas collects his leather belts from Simon, inspects them carefully to ensure they match the quality that was promised, and loads them onto Bess, along with several pounds of honey. He ultimately decided to purchase a small quantity of iron nails. Always in demand in Winchester, where building and repair are constant. Rather than seeking lodging in Farnham, Thomas decides to make progress back toward Winchester while daylight remains. He has made good sales, his purse is heavier with silver, and he is eager to be closer to home. The road south from Farnham is familiar now, the reverse of the journey he made this morning, but travel always looks different in the opposite direction, landmarks appearing from new angles, distances feeling shorter or longer, depending on whether you are moving toward or away from your destination. Thomas walks beside Bess, his mind calculating profits, deducting expenses, considering what goods he might purchase with his earnings to stock a more ambitious trading venture. He stops for the night at a small village called Bentley, where there is no proper inn, but where a widow named Marjorie is known to let rooms to travellers. The accommodation is simple, a straw pallet in a corner of the main room of her cottage, but it is clean and costs only a penny, including a meal of cabbage soup and bread. Marjorie is a talker, and over the simple meal she tells Thomas about her late husband who was a carpenter, about her son who has gone to work in London, about the harvest which has been good this year, but not as good as last year. Thomas listens politely, offering occasional comments, allowing her the pleasure of conversation. Loneliness is a constant companion in medieval life, particularly for widows and the elderly, and the arrival of a traveller is an event, a connection to the wider world beyond the village. The night is quiet except for the usual sounds of rural life, the distant bark of a dog, the cry of an owl hunting, the rustle of mice in the thatch. Thomas sleeps better than he did at the inn in Alton, perhaps because exhaustion has caught up with him, or perhaps because Marjorie's cottage feels safer, more domestic, less transient than the commercial space of an inn. He wakes once in the deep night and lies in the darkness thinking about the journey ahead, about the careful calculations that define his life, about the thin margin between success and failure that characterizes small-scale trade. The romantic image of the merchant as wealthy and secure applies only to a tiny fraction at the top of the commercial hierarchy. For every great merchant prince, there are hundreds like Thomas, working hard, taking risks, living on the edge of subsistence, but sustained by the hope of gradual advancement. Morning comes with roosters crowing and Marjorie stoking the fire. Thomas eats a breakfast of bread left over from last night's meal, thanks Marjorie for her hospitality, and is on the road by sunrise. The final leg of his journey back to Winchester is about 15 miles, a distance he can cover in a long day if the weather holds and the road remains passable. The morning is clear and cool, perfect travelling weather, and Thomas makes good progress, passing through Alton again by mid-morning and stopping only briefly to rest Bess and purchase ale from a vendor near the market square. The afternoon journey from Alton to Winchester covers familiar ground, the same road he travelled 2 days ago, but transformed by the direction of travel and by the satisfaction of a successful venture. Thomas's mind is already planning ahead, considering what goods he should stock for the next journey, whether he should venture farther afield to Oxford or perhaps south to Southampton, weighing the potential for greater profit against the increased costs and risks of longer journeys. This constant forward planning, this mental juggling of costs and opportunities, is the invisible work of commerce that is just as important as the physical labour of loading pack horses and standing in markets. Thomas encounters other travellers on the road, familiar faces from the market at Farnham, strangers heading in the opposite direction, a group of pilgrims who ask if he has heard news of any miracles or holy relics worth visiting. He shares what little he knows, directing them to a shrine near Alton, where a local saint is said to have healed the blind, though Thomas has no particular belief in such things. His faith is practical rather than mystical. He attends church, he respects the clergy, he observes the fasts and festivals, but his devotion is directed more toward earthly success than heavenly reward. This practical piety is common among merchants, men whose lives are spent in the material world of goods and money, who see religious observance as a duty and a social necessity rather than a consuming passion. By late afternoon, Thomas can see Winchester ahead, the cathedral tower rising above the surrounding countryside, a landmark visible for miles. The sight brings a sense of relief and homecoming, the end of a journey that has been successful but exhausting. He passes through the east gate again, the same gate he exited 3 days ago, and the gatekeeper who remembers him asks how his travels went. Thomas responds with non-committal pleasantries, not wanting to advertise his success too openly when the streets have ears and thieves have informants. He leads Bess back to the stable, arranges for her care, and carries his goods, the leather belts and honey and nails, back to his rented room above the cobbler's shop. Picture this moment as Thomas sits in his small room in the gathering dusk, counting out his silver pennies on the rough wooden table, calculating his profit. He spent £3 on cloth in Winchester. He paid perhaps 15 pennies in tolls, another 10 pennies in lodging and meals, 5 pennies in market fees. His sales in Farnham brought in £4 and 10 shillings. The goods he purchased for the return journey cost him about £1. His net profit, after all expenses, is approximately 15 shillings, a return of about 25% on his initial investment. It is not a fortune, but it is respectable, and if he can manage 4 or 5 such journeys per year, he can earn a living that places him comfortably above labourers and farmers, but below established craftsmen and shopkeepers. The mathematics of medieval commerce are straightforward but unforgiving. There is no room for error, no safety net, no insurance against loss. Every journey is a gamble, every transaction a test of judgment. Over the next few days, Thomas sells his return goods in Winchester, conducting small transactions with various buyers. A dozen belts sold in 2s and 3s to shopkeepers and craftsmen. Honey sold to a baker, nails to a carpenter. These sales are less dramatic than the market day trading in Farnham, but equally important to his business model. Winchester is his base, the place where he has built relationships and established trust, and these everyday sales maintain his presence in the local economy. Between transactions, he visits weavers and dyers, examining new cloth, discussing quality and prices, planning his next venture. He hears news from other merchants, talk of unrest in France, rumours of a mysterious sickness in the south, speculation about whether the king will raise taxes to fund new wars. This flow of information, this constant exchange of news and gossip, is vital to a merchant's success. Political instability affects trade routes. Disease affects labour costs and demand for goods. Wars create both dangers and opportunities. Thomas also attends to the social obligations that sustain his position in Winchester's commercial community. He spends an evening at the Guildhall, though as an itinerant merchant he is not a full member of the Merchant Guild. He is permitted to attend certain gatherings. Here he encounters other traders, sharing experiences, discussing market conditions, forming the alliances and understandings that facilitate business. He contributes to a collection for a guild member who has fallen ill and cannot work, knowing that someday he might need similar charity. He listens to a dispute between two merchants over a contract, offering no opinion but learning from the arguments how others interpret obligations and agreements. This is the informal education of a merchant, not learned from masters or books, but absorbed from observation and participation in the community of trade. As autumn deepens toward winter, Thomas begins to consider his options. The travelling season is coming to an end. Roads that are merely difficult in autumn become impassable in winter, frozen or turned to deep mud. Markets become less frequent and the risks of travel increase. Many travelling merchants spend the winter in town, living on their savings, doing small-scale trading, repairing equipment, planning for the spring. Thomas has enough profit from the summer and autumn to survive the winter if he is careful, but he is not comfortable with idleness. He considers taking work as a helper in a cloth shop, using the winter to learn more about the technical aspects of the trade, to build relationships with weavers and dyers that might give him advantages when spring comes and he takes to the road again. The popular image of medieval life often focuses on the dramatic, the battles and plagues and royal intrigues, but for someone like Thomas, life is defined by these quieter rhythms, the cycle of journeys and returns, the constant calculation of costs and profits, the slow accumulation of knowledge and capital. His story is not one of heroic adventure, but of persistent effort, of risks carefully calculated and mostly successful, of a man working within the constraints of his time and place to build a life of modest prosperity. He is neither wealthy nor poor, neither powerful nor powerless, but somewhere in the middle, a member of the growing commercial class that will eventually transform medieval society, but in 1347 is still finding its way, still negotiating its place in a world dominated by the ancient hierarchies of nobility and church. Imagine standing in Winchester on a November afternoon, watching Thomas lead Bess out through the city gates one more time before winter truly sets in, embarking on another journey to another market town, carrying another load of cloth, hoping for another successful sale. The scene would look much the same, whether we watched in 1247 or 1347 or 1447, the same kinds of goods, the same kinds of roads, the same kinds of people making the same kinds of journeys. The continuity of medieval commerce is remarkable. Technologies and techniques that persist for centuries, a stability that is both comforting and limiting. Thomas does not imagine that the world could be fundamentally different. He does not dream of steamships or railroads or international banking. His ambitions are practical and immediate: to make a profit on the next journey, to build his capital slowly, to perhaps someday achieve the security of a shop and a regular clientele, to marry and have children who might continue his trade. The reality of a medieval merchant's life, stripped of romantic embellishment, is hard work and careful planning, long hours of travel and longer hours of negotiation, the constant vigilance against theft and fraud, the endless calculations of weight and measure and price. It is also a life of freedom relative to the rigid structures that bind peasants to their land and nobles to their feudal obligations. Thomas can choose where to go, what to trade, who to do business with. His success or failure depends primarily on his own judgment and effort. This autonomy, limited though it is by the realities of medieval life, is precious, and it attracts ambitious men and women who prefer the uncertainties of trade to the certainties of agricultural labour or the constraints of craft guilds. As we follow Thomas through these final days before winter, visiting familiar contacts, negotiating small deals, preparing his equipment for storage, we see the medieval economy not as a simple or primitive system, but as a complex web of relationships and transactions, of trust and suspicion, of cooperation and competition. The merchant who succeeds is not necessarily the one with the most capital or the best goods, but the one who understands people, who can judge character and predict behaviour, who can build networks of reliable contacts across distances. Thomas's mental map of southern England is not primarily geographical but social, a network of faces and names and reputations, of knowing that Robert in Alton can be trusted, but the toll collector at such and such bridge is known to demand extra payment, of remembering that wool prices are typically lower in the autumn when sheep are brought down from summer pasture. This knowledge, accumulated over years of travel and trade, is Thomas's most valuable asset, more valuable than his pack horse or his stock of goods or even his capital. It cannot be easily stolen or lost, and it appreciates over time as he builds more relationships and gains more experience. It also cannot be easily transferred or sold, which means that Thomas's business depends entirely on his personal continued involvement. If he falls ill or is injured, if he dies, much of the value he has built disappears. This is one of the great vulnerabilities of small-scale medieval commerce, its dependence on individual knowledge and relationships rather than on institutions and written records that could survive the death or incapacity of any individual trader. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the medieval countryside with Thomas of Winchester. We hope you've gained a deeper understanding of the real world of medieval commerce, so different from the simplified images of either primitive barter or grand merchant princes. If you enjoyed this exploration of daily life in the 14th century and are still awake, we invite you to check out our other medieval content, including our pieces on daily life in a medieval manner, the reality of medieval warfare, and the world of medieval monasteries. And if you've fallen asleep somewhere along Thomas's journey, from Winchester to Farnham and back, please relax and enjoy the